Hi students. Okay, so today's class is going to be about, overall, it's going to be an introduction to the Odyssey, the first four books. But I'm going to get to that topic through comparing this idea of filial obligation in ancient China and ancient Greece. Filial obligation is sort of the duties of sons, specifically sons, to their fathers, or extrapolating from that, duties of children to their parents. And then a related idea that really speaks to the Odyssey is we'll talk a little bit more specifically about hospitality, like what it means to be a host, what it means to be a guest, the sort of customs of welcoming strangers into your home and into your culture. Okay, so here are my goals today. So first I'll introduce the Chinese tradition of filial piety via this tradition called the exemplars. So we'll compare that to the father-son themes that we have already seen in the Iliad, and then Greek culture more broadly. And that'll be a good way to introduce the Odyssey's major themes and opening lines, and the father-son themes in the Odyssey that we'll encounter. Then we'll do the hospitality stuff. We'll discuss books 1 through 4 via their emphasis on hospitality, and this Greek term that references hospitality, xenia, its importance to Greek culture, we'll discuss. And then we'll wrap up today thinking about various parts of books 1 through 4 and how they emphasize the legacy of the Trojan War. You guys have read the sort of highlights of the Iliad now, so you can kind of see the legacies of that conflict in this subsequent epic, the Odyssey, which is about a man trying to get home after the war. Okay, so these Chinese exemplars. So this is what the title is in Chinese, 二十四 Xiao. So the 24 filial exemplars. I have some images for you that are courtesy of NYU Shanghai professor Monica Lin, who is an artist and also an art history professor. And the rest of my content comes from her advisor, Professor David K. Jordan's website about the exemplars. But just so you know about this tradition, it's this very foundational document that articulates folk traditions that are about this theme of filial piety. So again, filial piety means philos is a word for sons, and then piety is like piousness or kind of like piety is sort of has aspects of sacredness in it, but filial piety is like how to be a good, honorable son or child to your parents. The author of these exemplars is Guo Jujing. He lived during the Yuan dynasty, so rather later than the ancient period. So you might be thinking, why are we talking about this? Even though he wrote about this stuff rather later, this tradition is very long-standing and very ancient. This is where the guy is from, Fujian province. So the exemplar, it's like a book of these lessons, and it's not officially a part of the canon of works attributed or inspired by Confucius, but the emphasis on the duties of sons to fathers and children to parents are so tied up in ideas that do derive from Confucius. So this is kind of a way of talking about Confucius without explicitly talking about him. This is just a lot more examples of sort of Confucian ideas of sons and their duties to dads and moms. Okay, so here's one. I've just kind of picked and chose exemplars, and then these are Monica Lin's book, what do you call these, wood prints images. So she's trying to depict the scene discussed here. So here it is in translation. Zheng Shen's mother bit her finger. His heart felt the pain. He bundled up the firewood and ran home just in time. What age has ever witnessed deeper ties of filial love than the depth shared between this mother and her son? Okay, so this is pretty wild if you picture what is being described here. This woman bites her own finger, like causes harm to herself, and yet her son is the one who feels the pain of that harm. his heart felt the pain. And he feels it so much from like a distance, it seems, that he just runs home just in time to like comfort her, I guess, or to, I don't know. And then, of course, he kind of turns outward. What age has ever witnessed the deeper ties of filial love than this, shared between mother and her son? So, kind of interesting. Potentially, I'll show you a couple more, and then we'll talk about them more in general. Okay, here's another one. One's quite weird. Exemplar 7. Okay, his parents needed milk, their eyes to cure. He robed his body in a suit of fur. If he had failed to shout aloud, "Don't shoot!" the hunter would have killed him for a deer. Okay, so this is quite odd as well. So it seems to me that this young man's parents needed some sort of milk treatment for their eyes. So there's having some sort of problem with their eyes. They need milk. It seems to be deer milk because the boy dresses up like a deer to go steal some milk from deer, I guess. And he looks so much like a deer that hunters think he might be a deer, and so are about to shoot him, but then he says, don't shoot. So this is quite interesting, but here we have a son willing to risk his life to save his parents, to help them. He's willing to steal on behalf of his parents. This doesn't seem to be his milk, which is why he needs to dress up like a deer to steal it, to get it. Let me think. I think I have a couple more. Okay, this one, I really hate this one because I hate mosquitoes. But okay, so exemplar 11. Okay, on summer nights, without a mosquito net, when mosquitoes are many, he dares not wave them off. They gorge themselves on his flesh and blood, and thus he avoids their bothering his parents. So, yeah. What sacrifice, right? This son is so dutiful that he exposes his own arms and his body to the mosquitoes so that the mosquitoes don't bother his parents. He lets them sleep. He lets his parents sleep. He lets the mosquitoes eat his blood so that his parents sleep soundly. Is that all? Okay, yeah. So quite strange. So again, I think Professor Lin picked some of the really dynamic ones to depict in her images here. And she was really inspired to depict them because they are so strange and so extreme in their depictions of piety, of children really sacrificing their lives for their parents. So, okay, what is this tradition about? Why does it exist? And so you probably have your own ideas about it. Some of the things I'll say are like this is a question, like why do Confucian ideals so emphasize the duties of children to their parents? Yeah, I mean, it's a way of honoring the past and ensuring that the next generation will not forget about the past. They will literally live for their parents. They'll literally live for the traditions that came before them. And so this is a way, like if you instill these kinds of values in your population, it's a way of ensuring that the traditions and systems in place will continue on into the future. So, I mean, there's a great incentive for cultures to emphasize the duties of children to their parents. Think of the opposite. Like if children are only meant to rebel and, do whatever they want, of course they're going to want to follow their own paths. That's what humans do. We're pretty egotistical as beings. We try to save ourselves for, the most part. But if you instill these sort of duties and these expectations for parents, to honor parents, it's a good way of maintaining stability in a culture. I've had students in the past kind of think a little bit more about this tradition, and they pointed out like these are extreme examples, and they're meant to be they're like so extreme that they seem kind of almost silly. But it's just sort of shorthand ways of pointing to these examples of good sons and good daughters and stuff, so that parents can kind of like, point them out to their kids. In fact, the word exemplar itself, you probably recognize it via its connection to the word example. So like these are examples of like good, dutiful children. They're sort of like teaching examples, you know. Of course, I don't think that these sort of that these sort of situations actually occurred, because this is rather like nutty. It's a little crazy, but these exemplars might exist so that parents can point to them and be like, "Hey, son, look at how good this kid is. The kid in exemplar 11, he, lets the mosquitoes eat his blood so that his parents are safe to sleep. So he honors their sleep more than his well-being. Because like of course he doesn't get to sleep. If you're being eaten alive by mosquitoes, like that's not a fun night for you. So anyway, so yeah, it's just a way of kind of like to the extreme, instituting these sorts of values into the next generation. And some of my students pointed out that it might have been a way for citizens to kind of project an image of dutifulness, even if they're kind of not ascribing to that literally. They could be like, oh, well, I'm as a dutiful son as the son in exemplar 11. And so you could just say that, and people would be like, okay, yes, great. So just a way of kind of like performing filial piety. So anyway, feel free to bring questions to the discussion about this if you have them, or if you know of more exemplars, they're pretty interesting. So I wanted to point out that actually we've been encountering these sorts of ideas in the Iliad as well. This sort of emphasis of a culture on honoring the past, in the next generation. So here just are some examples of fathers and sons in the Iliad to remind you. So we have an example of a divine father in Zeus with his son Sarpedon, a mortal son. Zeus is also considered like the father of all the gods. Like as the king of the gods, he's sort of like the sort of patriarchal head of the whole line of the divine beings in this universe. But we also saw mortal fathers in the Iliad. So just to remind you of these lines of Hector when he raises his baby son and kisses him, and then he offers a prayer to Zeus. He says, I pray, grant my boy that he'll be strong and brave like me, rule Troy in all power, and one day let them say he is a better man than his father. So we have this kind of example of a really, really fantastic Greek man, Greek father who actually wants his son to be better than him. This is very rare, we said, in the Greek tradition. But Hector is a very exemplary figure. And then, of course, the end point of Achilles' rage has a lot to do with him thinking of his own father. So he starts thinking of his father Peleus, how privileged his father was, and yet he's not so privileged as to have a really good son who will care for him in his old age. So Achilles thinking of himself as a bad son. I give the man no care as he grows old, since here I sit in Troy, far from my fatherland. He's basically admonishing himself for being a bad son. And that's part of the reason why he changes his attitude about Hector and offers Hector's body back to Priam. And so, of course, Priam is a preeminent figure of a father in the Iliad as well. He's father of 50 sons. He's very old, very respectable king. Clearly the Iliad is very interested in honoring fathers. So much of the plot relies upon the sort of the sadness of a father who loses his son too early and who loses his own life too early. And the fact that the baby, who should have been a better man than his father, the baby dies too, in the myth. Achilles thinking of his own father. Anyway, the Iliad clearly wants us to think very well of the idea of fatherhood. This is sort of broadcasting forward a little bit, but just so you know, these myths were circulating at the same time here, but we will read more about this myth in particular. It will be referenced in the Iliad, but it will also, it'll be referenced in the Odyssey, but it will also come up in the Aeneid, which is the Epic of Rome. But there's a mythological tale. As Troy is falling in the myth, Priam, the king, Hector's father, is killed by Achilles' son. So in our version of the Iliad, I don't think we really heard Achilles talking about the fact that he has a son. Like I think Homer doesn't talk about that. It's not really important to him. But there is this other version of events in myth that Achilles' son, his name is Neoptolemus. He is the one who kills Priam. So it's rather interesting. We'll read all about it in the Aeneid. Oh, right, this is a sort of culture more broadly. So there's a connection to Rome, narrated in book 2. We'll read this book, so don't worry, you'll get to read it. Why I'm bringing this up now is in this tale, the idea is that the son figure, Neoptolemus, is avenging his father's death. So Achilles was killed by Paris. Neoptolemus, feeling bad that his father was killed, in turn he wants to kill, someone responsible for his father's death, so he kills Priam. But note how much this little bit of the story completely reverses what happened in the Iliad. Remember, in the Iliad, Achilles, feels pity for Priam, and then gives Priam, his son's body back. But here, Neoptolemus feels no pity for Priam any longer. He wants to avenge his father's death. So these stories are so intertwined and sometimes contradictory even. Like, the fact that like fatherhood can be so glorified in one instance, but also here, like, there's no respect for the father Priam in this sense. Rather, the respect is from Neoptolemus to his own father Achilles and Achilles' memory. So anyway, we're kind of pointing out here a little bit that there might be some tensions and contradictory ideas in this value of filial piety, at least in the Greek world. I bring this up because the theme of a son avenging on behalf of his father, it animates some things in the Odyssey. We will meet a son who is in a particularly interesting position relative to his father. And should he take revenge on those people who have harmed his father or not? Okay, so I'll leave that there. If that didn't make a ton of sense right now, you might come back to this lecture later and think about it. But, okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so the father-son theme, it goes throughout the Odyssey for sure as well. It's got a different kind of valence on the theme, however, because we spend more time with the son figure in the Odyssey than we did in the Iliad. Okay, so anyway, just so you know, one of the first lines about father-son stuff in the Odyssey presents it as a bit of a problem. So it's presented as a problem for Telemachus, that's our son figure, and then also Homer, that they are inferior to past generation of Greeks. So Telemachus is inferior to his own father, and then Homer might be saying or suggesting by that the Greeks are inferior to this earlier, more glorious generation of heroes, the men who fought at Troy, for example. Okay, so Athena is a character in the Odyssey, major character in the Odyssey, and she says this to Telemachus directly. So Telemachus is Odysseus' son, by the way. Okay, so she goes, "It is rare for sons to be like fathers. Only a few are better, most are worse." So think about what this means, It's contradictory to what Hector wanted for his son, but it does definitely jive or like resonate with the theme of filial piety that I introduced this lecture with. The idea that like sons owe duty and obligations to the past generation because the past generation was a little bit better. I think Confucius probably wouldn't say it in terms of like better and worse, but the Greeks certainly would. They would be like, the past was better, our present day or sons are worse than their fathers. So that might be something to point out here, that like even though the sentiment is kind of the same, there's a definite honor on the past generations. Greeks really like thinking in terms of better and worse. They like to rank things a lot. Okay, so anyway, keeping this in mind, let's introduce Homer's Odyssey. So I've already started talking about it a little bit, but here's more of an introduction to it, just so you get started as you read. This poem is what is referred to as a Nostos poem. So we talked about the terms Nostos and Kleos in an earlier lecture about Achilles' choice of two fates. In a large part, the Iliad is a Kleos poem. It's a poem about glorious battles. It's about the glorious battle of Troy. A Nostos poem is about a glorious homecoming. So a man coming home after battle. That's what a Nostos poem is. The Odyssey is about home, homecoming, hospitality. It's about how a man who sacrificed pretty much everything except for his life in this war is able to come back home, and how he can be reacclimated to his home life after he's been so damaged and so tossed around and by war. So in part, the Odyssey is a soldier's story. It really tries to answer this question about Odysseus himself. So Odysseus was one of the heroes in the Trojan War. How can a man like that come back home? Just to remind you, the Trojan War was 10 years. It takes Odysseus 10 years to get home. So it might be about that issue. Here we go. So in a way, it might be a little bit metaphorical. The Odyssey might be a little bit metaphorical about like how a soldier can reacclimate to civilian life after war. In part, the Odyssey is also a father-son story. How does a son come to know his father? How do you reckon with the legacy of your father in your own life? These are the sort of questions that Telemachus has to deal with in the Odyssey. His father has been away for 20 years. Telemachus is around 20 years old. So he has come of age. He's a young man, but he's come of age without ever really knowing who his father is. He's never really met him in a way that he can remember. And so if you're in a position like that where you don't really know your father, but you've heard stories about him, like how do you come to know your father? That's sort of his journey in the epic. And then, we can extrapolate outward here. This might be something you relate to as well. How do you reckon with the legacy of your father in your own life? Whether your father is present in your life or absent, you probably still are reckoning with that legacy. It means something if your father is there, or if he isn't there, or if he's sort of there, or whatever. Fathers are tricky topics usually in art and culture. And so this is sort of Telemachus' journey. And then another part of the Odyssey is that it's a husband-wife story. So just like Odysseus was gone for 20 years at war and then trying to get home, and so that his son never really knew him, the same goes, not the same exactly, but a similar situation is happening with his wife. So his wife, had this husband that she had a baby with, and then he leaves for 20 years, and she doesn't really know what's going on. So, this is Penelope's sort of part of the story. Her problems that she's dealing with in the epic are things like this. What can you really know about your spouse? And then also this one, how do you reconnect after a period of absence, literal or figurative? So how does a soldier come home from war, but how does his wife accept him home after what he's been through? How does a son accept his father and stuff? So anyway, part of the reason why I'm having you read the whole of the Odyssey is it is to a large extent, it's a much more complicated story because it's so interrelational. It really is thinking about like how is a home constituted, how is a family constituted, especially after a period of such absence. So anyway, I hope you like the Odyssey as you read it, but it's much more complicated in a lot of ways. Okay, so here's the Odyssey's first line in Greek. So I won't read this because I don't know Greek myself, but I want to highlight this word here. That starts with pi. It's polytropic, I believe. Polytropic, yeah. And here is the word in English. Polytropic. It's a weird word. We don't see it very often. It's hard to translate it. That's why people just used the Greek and just rendered it in English. Polytropic. Like they didn't even try to like come up with a new word for it. But anyway, it means so poly means many. Trope means sides. So many-sided. So it means turning many ways, versatile, also much traveled. This much traveled part is in reference to Odysseus's travels in the Odyssey. Okay, so here are the first line of the Odyssey. I'm giving it to you in different translations in English. So here's one from 1919. Tell me, O Muse, of that many-sided hero who traveled far and wide. So, you know, thinking of the Iliad, which was like rage, goddess sing the rage of Peleus' immortal son, Achilles. So it was about rage, it was about Achilles in the Iliad. Here, in the Odyssey, we are hearing of a many-sided man who traveled far and wide. Okay, all right. Here's this man Fitzgerald. He's a poet. So here's his sort of rendering of the first line. Okay, sing in me, Muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending, the wanderer harried for years on end. So how he translates polytropic is a polytropic man is a man skilled in all ways of contending and a wanderer. So he can fight in various ways. He's very skilled in different ways of contending. Fagles, this is the guy who did our translation for the Iliad, but I didn't pick him for your Odyssey. Okay, so he translates the first line as, sing to me of the man Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. So polytropic man here is the man of twists and turns. So here he's kind of giving us a sense that Odysseus is very exciting. He's got many twists, many turns. He's dynamic, and then he was driven time and again off course. He had trouble sticking to the course. Okay, here's our translator, Emily Wilson. She's the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English. Here's how she does it. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost. So partly I want to emphasize this line here because you kind of get a sense of what Wilson is trying to emphasize in her translation. So instead of a man of twists and turns or a man skilled in all ways of contending, she translates polytropic as a complicated man. So he may be amazing, he may have a lot of adventures and stuff, but he's also really complicated. So that's what she's trying to emphasize, that he's not just exciting, he's also like maybe kind of hard to deal with or hard to understand. Any man who's been away for 20 years and tries to come back, you know, you would think that that's probably a really complicated person. And Odysseus really is a complicated person. She also says, tell me how he wandered and was lost. So instead of being driven off course, like as if that's something that's happening to him, she emphasizes that it might be something he did to himself. He wandered and then became lost, and he was lost. So it might be a little bit more critical of him here. But anyway, Odysseus is a complicated guy, so you'll get to read more about him as you read the epic. Okay, speaking of this complication stuff, the complicated man, the opening of the epic is trying to thematize this sort of frustration we would feel with a complicated man like Odysseus. So I'm going to read this aloud and then I'll talk about it. This is a part of the epic when Athena comes down to Ithaca, the kingdom of Odysseus. She comes down to talk to Telemachus to see how he's feeling. She does so in disguise. So it's Athena, the goddess of wartime strategy, the goddess of wisdom. She comes down in disguise as a man and talks to Telemachus. Okay, so Telemachus leaned in, close to Athena, so they, the suitors, would not hear, and said, "Dear guest, excuse my saying this. These men are only interested in music, a life of ease. They make no contribution. This food belongs to someone else, a man whose white bones may be lying in the rain or sunk beneath the waves. If they saw him return to Ithaca, they would all pray for faster feet, instead of wealth and gold and fancy clothes. In fact, he must have died. We have no hope. He will not come back home. If someone says so, we do not believe it. So this is a really interesting speech from Telemachus. So he's being conspiratorial to Athena, leaning in so that the suitors don't hear him. But as he starts to describe his father, he describes his father as this man who may be dead, we don't know. You get the sense that he's actually really frustrated with this lack of knowledge about his father. You know, maybe he's dead, maybe his white bones are lying in the rain, sunk beneath the waves. So he thinks about his death, but then he thinks about like what would happen if Odysseus returned. If the suitors saw my dad return to Ithaca, they would all pray for faster feet. So he seems to really want his dad to return. Like, he wants his dad to return so that the suitors will be, you know, scared away. And then he flips again. He says, well, in fact, he must have died. You know, he must be dead. Because if he was alive, he would be here. You know, this kind of sense you get that Telemachus really wishes his dad was here. And then he says, this is a very hopeless statement, we have no hope. We have no hope for the father. He will not come back home. If someone says so, we do not believe it. Here, you know, this may be completely true. Maybe this is exactly what he thinks. If someone says so, we do not believe it. But I hear, you know, in this line, I hear behind it the kind of hope that he does wish his father will come back home. He says he will not come back home, but you know, you get the feeling that Telemachus is actually really, really, he's really sad that his father hasn't come back home. He's really angry his father hasn't come back home. On the other hand, he really hopes his father will come home and scare these suitors away. He's hopeful that he will. In short, he's kind of frustrated. He doesn't know how to feel because there's too much outside of his own control. His father's not here, you know, who would make things easier for him. So anyway, Homer does his best to try to thematize this sense of frustration, this sense that, like, the absence of a father figure would frustrate you because it leaves you with very little to do. You know, like, how can Telemachus become an adult when his father isn't around, is the kind of idea here. Suitors, this is the term that's used in the Odyssey to refer to the mostly young men who are hanging around Ithaca trying to get Penelope to marry them. So with Odysseus away, the kingdom is without its king, and it's got a lot of wealth and property. So the suitors are hanging around hoping that Penelope will choose them to marry so that they will get control of the property. And so Telemachus here is the young man who's, you know, is kind of put in a weird position here where, like, all these guys are trying to, like, marry his mom. Meanwhile, his father is not coming home. He may be dead, maybe not, whatever. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. I'll keep going. So Telemachus is frustrated in this kind of opening speech. He's frustrated by his father's absence, but the epic itself puts us as readers into a frustrating situation. The epic is called the Odyssey. It should be about Odysseus. You know, the Odyssey is the story of Odysseus. However, we don't really get to meet Odysseus until book 5. So just like Telemachus is yearning and sort of frustrated by yearning for his father, frustrated by his father's absence, Homer puts us in that position too. He tells us the story is going to be about Odysseus, and we don't really get to meet Odysseus until book 5, like, you know, hundreds of pages in. Okay, so we do get to meet Odysseus' son Telemachus, and we see him looking for father figures. So remember, his dad is absent. He's looking for other guys to kind of fill that role. Athena is in disguise as this figure named Mentes. This is the root of the English word mentor, so someone who can teach you or guide you. Telemachus says this to Mentes. I find this very cute. So Telemachus is a young man, so I'll try to say it like a young man. So he's very excited to see a figure who is a good mentor for him. So he starts asking him questions. But come now, tell me the truth. Who are you? From what city? And what parents? What kind of ship did you arrive here on? What sailors brought you here? And by what route? You surely did not travel here on foot. Here is the thing I really want to know. Have you been here before? Are you a friend who visited my father? Many men came to his house. He traveled many places. So again, like, what Telemachus really wants to know is, well, first he wants to, greet this guest and hear stories of other places, because he's never left his own home. But he also wants to hear about his father. Like, are you a friend? You visited my dad? Maybe he can hear stories about his own father here. And then he gets to brag about his dad. He had many men come into his house. He traveled many places. So these are things he knows about his father, but things that he's never really witnessed because his father's never been around. Telemachus really wants a father. Another thing that's interesting about Telemachus' situation is, so he's got in this very unique situation where he's the son of an absent father. People keep telling him stories about good sons and how they behave. So he hears this story that I'm going to read in just a second. So Telemachus and Odysseus, they're the central father-son relationship of the epic. But we often hear this story of Agamemnon and his son Orestes. So Agamemnon, you'll remember from the Iliad. He was the kind of jerk who treated Achilles badly at the beginning of the Iliad. But he's the most powerful king present on the Achaean side of the Trojan War. So here's a father-son situation too. Agamemnon technically does have a Nostos poem too, or not poem, he has a Nostos. He gets to have a sort of glorious homecoming. So he was the most powerful king on the Achaean side. They won the war. He gets a lot of riches, a lot of slaves. He gets a lot of glory after Troy. He tries to take it all home, and he gets to his house in Argos, but when he comes home, he's pretty immediately murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, Aegisthus. Her lover is actually his cousin as well. So when he comes home, he finds out his wife's been cheating on him with his cousin, and he's also murdered. It's a pretty exciting story that we'll read in the Aeschylus play Agamemnon. We'll also hear more about it in the Odyssey. But so here's kind of like the brief story we hear is that Orestes, the son, eventually avenges Agamemnon's death by killing his mother, Clytemnestra. So this is interesting. So like the Orestes story is kind of presented to Telemachus as the story of a model son. Here's what happens when a father is treated badly. The son avenges the father. So Telemachus is kind of in a situation where, like, should he avenge his own father? Is his father even dead? He's in this very interesting situation. Here's just an image to kind of visualize. This is Orestes working with, I forget who he works with. His sister helps him at one point, Electra. But anyway, they kill Aegisthus. They also kill Clytemnestra. And again, we'll read more about that later in this semester. So anyway, this is something Telemachus is contending with. He's got an absent father, but he hears what a good son should do. Here's the lines in the epic. Athena, as Mentes, telling Telemachus, "You surely heard how everybody praised Orestes when he killed the man who killed his famous father." So, okay, all right. Maybe good sons are those who murder on behalf of their dads. Okay, Athena continues on to speak about Odysseus. She says, "I came because they told me that your father was here, but now it seems that the gods have blocked his path back home. But I am sure he is not dead. The wide sea keeps him trapped upon some island, captured by fierce men who will not let him go. Now I will make a prophecy the gods have given me, and I think it will all come true, although I am no prophet. He will not be gone much longer from his own dear native land, even if chains of iron hold him fast. He will devise a means of getting home. He is resourceful. Tell me now, are you Odysseus' son? You are so tall." Okay, so this is pretty interesting. Athena in disguise. Athena is a goddess. She knows everything pretty much. She says, "I'll make a prophecy, and I think it will come true, although I am no prophet." She is exactly a prophet. She's a goddess. She knows exactly what is going to happen in the future. He will not be gone longer. Blah, blah, blah. He will devise a means of getting home. He is resourceful. That's very true, but also Odysseus will be helped on his way home by Athena. She also asks Asmintes, "Are you his son?" She knows exactly who she's talking to. So this is kind of something to keep in mind as you read. Odysseus is a complicated man. Athena is a complicated goddess. In a large part, they're both liars. So here's a prime example of Athena totally lying. She's pretending to be a different person and pretending she doesn't know what she actually knows. She could have come down to Telemachus and say, "Hey, Telemachus, I'm Athena. Your father's going to come home. Don't you worry. It'll be fine." But that's not what she does. She presents herself as a man and giving him advice. There's a lot of lies in here. She says, he will not be gone. Odysseus will not be gone much longer from his own dear native land, even if chains of iron hold him fast. It's up here. The wide sea keeps him trapped upon some island, captured by fierce men who will not let him go. This is not true. Odysseus is actually being kept on an island. He's not really being kept on an island. He's living with a goddess who he is sleeping with on an island. So that's not exactly true that he's being captured by these fierce men who aren't going to let him go. But you might think about why Athena is lying about this in a particular way. Anyway. Okay, so kind of interesting. This father figure to Telemachus, who is actually a goddess in disguise. It's kind of an interesting twist on fatherhood in ancient Greek world. Okay. This is a really important line that I want to spend some time with too. So right after Athena asks him, "Tell me, are you Odysseus' son? You are so tall." This is what Telemachus says. Telemachus was careful as he answered, "Dear guest, I will be frank with you. My mother says I am his son, but I cannot be sure, since no one knows his own begetting. I wish I were the son of someone lucky, who could grow old at home with all his wealth. Instead, the most unlucky man alive is said to be my father, since you ask." So, this is his careful answer. So, technically, Telemachus says, yes, Odysseus is my father, but notice how slippery he is in his answer. "Dear guest, I will be frank with you. My mother says I am his son, but I cannot be sure, since no one knows his own begetting." I'm going to read that again. "My mother says I am his son, but I cannot be sure, since no one knows his own begetting." This is rather interesting. What if someone asked you if your father was your father, and you said, "Well, my mom says so"? He's sort of implying that maybe his mother is lying to him. "My mother says I am his son." That's what she says. But she would have an incentive to saying that, because her reputation, her chastity would be at issue if I am not Odysseus' son, is kind of what he's suggesting a little bit here. So there's a little bit of suggestion of, maybe thinking maybe his mother's lying or something. I don't really believe he thinks that, but rather the second part. "My mother says I am his son, but I cannot be sure, since no one knows his own beginning." So my mother, and maybe even other people, say that I am the son of Odysseus, but how can anyone know who your father is? Because it's kind of impossible, right? It's impossible in the ancient world to know. I think nowadays we can have DNA testing and stuff like that, but this is kind of a true statement. No one knows his own begetting. You might know who your mother is, I guess, potentially, if you come out of your mother, biologically, but no one really knows his own begetting. No one knows who, basically he's saying no one literally knows who their father is. Which is kind of true, how can you really know? You might ask yourself, how do you know? How do you know who your parents are? In some sense, you hear stories, maybe from grandparents and from brothers, sisters, whatever. You know who your parents are in some abstract way, but do you know? You know how to tie your shoes. Do you know in the same way who your parents are? In the way that you know how to, do multiplication tables or tie your shoes or something like that. I highlighted this phrase here, "no one knows his own begetting," because this is actually a philosophical issue. How do you know where you come from? Like, how does anyone know where you come from? Telemachus is in a particularly tricky situation because he didn't grow up with his father. If his father was around when he was growing up, he wouldn't have this much doubt. He would see his father and recognize commonalities between he and his father, maybe common interests, maybe they look similar or something like that. But his father hasn't been around. So he knows Odysseus is his father. He's heard these stories and everything like that. But actually, he doesn't really know. And in fact, no one knows, exactly where you come from. So anyway, we'll talk about this line again because it's an issue. We'll talk about it in the Odyssey and also in other texts as well, because it seems like it's a problem to not know exactly where you come from, but maybe it's actually not a bad thing too. One last thing I'll say here is largely how you know where you come from is by hearing stories about where you came from. You hear the story that your mother tells you of your birth, like your birthday, or maybe your grandmother or something. Or if you're adopted, you might hear the story of how your adopted parents chose you. So you hear these stories from other people. So in some sense, no one really knows their own begetting, but if you have relationships with other people, they can help you come to know where you come from, if that makes sense. So this kind of speaks to some of the stuff I was talking about before, where the Odyssey is about relationships. It's about like how a culture reinforces itself through relationships, and how knowledge and how values are extended into next generations, through these sorts of relationships. Okay, keep going. So Telemachus' problem in the epic is his absent father. That's really his main problem. To kind of set you up as you read, Telemachus can't really act in the epic until he knows for certain whether Odysseus is alive or dead. So he's told that a good son like Orestes will kill their father's murderer. But Odysseus might not be murdered. He might still be alive. So Telemachus is in kind of a tricky situation, not without knowing he doesn't know exactly what to do. His other problem, he only knows his father through stories about him. He feels kind of cheated in that way. His father is supposedly a really great guy. He hears all these great stories. But well, if that's the case, if he's so great, where is he? Why isn't he around? Moreover, Telemachus feels he doesn't know who he is because he doesn't know his father. So this is sort of his psychological journey in the epic. No one knows his own begetting. Telemachus will come to know his father, and by coming to know his father, he'll come to know a little bit more about himself. And so that's really his journey in the epic. So this speaks to a broader, more general problem of knowledge. How do any of us know where we come from? Do any of us truly know our own begetting? So this word begetting, I think I talked about this in one of the lecture about the Bible. But to beget is the same as to sire. It's like a man having a child with a woman. So the word beget is it's kind of like I mean, women, the idea would be like women, biological women or whatever, biological females give birth, biological males beget offspring. So that's the kind of word here. Anyway, so yeah, fathers. They're hard to know. Okay, how do you know who you are? Okay. All right. So you might pause with these questions a little bit. Okay. Going to have a little bit of a transition to this idea of hospitality. These ideas are very related to the father stuff, but we're kind of getting a little bit more cultural, more broad. Hospitality in Greek culture in the Odyssey. So I have an image here of islands. This is one of the sort of archipelago regions of Greece, just to remind you of the geography we're dealing with in the Odyssey. Greece is a system of coastlines and islands. It's a very aquatic culture. Hospitality is very important in those sorts of geographical regions. Okay, so here's the idea of hospitality in ancient Greek culture. It's referenced through this term xenia. I'll talk about that painting in a second. Okay, so xenia in Greek, it translates roughly to something like guest friendship. So it's a system of customs or of the rights extended to guests. So like if you're a host, how kind you are to guests, like how you host them in your house. It comes from the root of xenos or xeno, which means literally stranger or foreigner. So we do have this word xenophobia in English that you might have heard. Phobia meaning fear, xeno meaning stranger, fear of strangers. So if you're xenophobic, you don't really like immigrants, really. You're afraid of foreigners, kind of thing. Okay, so the meaning, this is the meaning that I think is most useful. Xenia means making a stranger into a guest and then a guest into a friend. So the custom of hospitality, or xenia in Greek, is turning strangers ideally into friends. And so why would you want to do that? Anyway. Think about Greece being this like nation of islands. It's very prone to attack from the sea. But if you can turn a stranger into a guest and a guest into your friend, then you have an ally and you can kind of build your culture more broadly. I have this image here that depicts a story of a theoxenia. These stories are really common in ancient tales. Theoxenia, the root for God. So like guest friendship of the gods. So there's these stories where like a god dresses up, pretends to be a commoner, and as a way to test the common people to see how they treat strangers. And so here's Zeus and Hermes, Mercurius, or Mercury is also Hermes. Anyway, they kind of disguise themselves and then go into this these common people's home and just to test them. If you know anything about Christianity, there's a lot of stories in the New Testament where, like, I think Jesus is kind of doing this a little bit. Jesus is, Christ, but he comes into the form of a man or whatever. He's like embodied as a sort of common human, but he's actually a god, in disguise kind of idea. So yeah. Anyway, a lot of ancient stories have these sorts of emphasis to be kind to strangers, and it's a way to test humans' respect for the gods. You might think of examples in your own cultures and stuff. Anyway, I'll keep going. Okay, so one way to kind of think about xenia is, I was sort of hinting at it before, but anthropologically, it makes a lot of sense to have a culture that really values hospitality, xenia. To kind of talk about this importance to Greek culture, I want to introduce a little bit of this anthropological theory that has, it makes connections between the world of economics and socio-political connections. So, okay, so I'm going to introduce this anthropological study. It's called the Kula ring system. That this guy Malinowski, he's like the father of the field of anthropology. So he studied the Kula ring, which was a system of economic and political and social interchange between the islands around Papua New Guinea. Okay, so foundational to the field of anthropology. So this white guy, Malinowski, went down to Papua New Guinea and saw the system of interchange among these islands and studied it, wrote about it, and then the idea is that like a lot of cultures use systems of exchange like this one that he studied, and in a way, Greek culture kind of fits this system too. So I'm not saying that the Greek islands are exactly like Papua New Guinea islands, but I'm just saying that like a similar system might be underlying what's going on in the Odyssey. So let me talk to you about this system. So the Kula ring that Malinowski studied and wrote about is this. So the rings are the circles of exchange between island nation. I'm not sure if they're nations, but like these little island communities in Papua New Guinea. So this arrow going, I guess it's counterclockwise. This is the direction of arm shell movements. An arm shell is like a bracelet. And then the going in the opposite direction is this necklace. Okay, so what happens is like this nation, like they have the necklace or something for a while, and then they go on a little trip, and then they bring the necklace to like this nation, and then eventually they'll bring it to this nation, and then this nation, whatever. It goes. That's how the necklace moves. Meanwhile, these nations are going this way. So everyone's kind of like going at cross purposes and stuff like that. And what they're doing is exchanging the gift of the arm shell or the gift of the necklace in this kind of ritualistic exchange. So like if this community goes here, they have this ceremony, this ritual where they give the necklace in this kind of like very ritualized exchange, and it's kind of like passed on or whatever. And then, yeah, so it seems like just a complete exchange of gifts, from nation to nation. Like they're just kind of like trading ownership of it, like, as the ring continues and as, the days go by and all that. But while the gift is being exchanged, the nations are also, underneath the ritualized ceremony, they're also having economic exchange, which is more based on like money or like exchange of goods. So this gift exchange thing is kind of like happening on top of the system of economic exchange, where like items are actually sold and ownership is actually transferred, like, period. The gift exchange, ownership is never really transferred, period. It's just sort of like you are loaned the necklace or the arm shell for a particular period of time. Okay, so hopefully that made sense. You might ask yourself, like, why are they doing this? Why have these big ceremonies where they're exchanging a gift that they're never getting to keep for very long? So, like, think about that for a second. Why have these ceremonies where gifts are being exchanged? And they're not really gifts for good. They're gifts, you keep the gift for like a week or a month or something, and then you exchange it to the next nation in a new ceremony. Why? Think about it this way. Like, what if this nation, like, refuses to give the necklace up? What if they, like, decide to keep the necklace forever? That might signal to other nations nearby that, like, there's a problem going on. If you always have this kind of, like, custom of exchange that is systematic, where everyone knows what comes next, then you kind of have the means by which you organize connections. You organize sort of society, that kind of thing. You might think in your own experience, like, do you know of any sort of system like this where, like, there's like a ceremony where people are given this thing that they're not expected to keep for very long? Try to think of something like that. I know I'm going to give you two examples. One is the Stanley Cup in hockey. Like, I think the Stanley Cup, there's only one, and they kind of give it to whoever wins each year. And so the idea is, like, it's the honor for those people to have for a year, but then they give it up to whoever wins the next year. I think, like, pageants work like that too a little bit. But, like, think of what it would mean if, like, one hockey team refuses to give up the Stanley Cup. They're like, no, we're keeping this forever. Like, that might be kind of a signal that they're being very selfish or self-absorbed. It might be a signal of, like, I don't know, something crazy. Here's another example. China loves to, I'm not sure if they love to, but they tend to share pandas. Like, pandas kind of go on tour throughout China and sometimes even more further abroad. So they, like, fly the panda around. Like, what if a zoo refused to give up a panda, This might be kind of like a signal that there's, like, disquiet among the nations or something like this. So that's kind of like how the Kula ring operates. So as long as the gift exchange system is functioning properly, then the economic exchange stuff can happen too. Like, you have a reason to have a relationship with each other because you have these kind of like set dates where people can exchange and kind of like honor each other and do the customs, do the rituals and stuff like that. And so, yeah, it's a way to protect the economic exchange. Um, okay, hopefully that makes sense. So anyway, this is kind of something that I think is undergirding the first, especially the first few books of the Odyssey. Here's some examples of Xenia in the Odyssey. So, in fact, the book kind of begins with this issue of Xenia. Here's Zeus talking about the situation at Ithaca, which is Odysseus' island. He says, "This is absurd that mortals blame the gods. They say we cause their suffering, but they themselves increase it by folly." So Aegisthus overstepped. He took the legal wife of Agamemnon, then killed the husband when he came back home, although he knew that it would doom them all. Athena looked at him steadily and answered, "Father, he did deserve to die. Bring death to all who act like him." So here's the story of Agamemnon's death by Aegisthus and Clytemnestra. But Zeus terms that crime as a crime against Xenia. Aegisthus overstepped. He took the legal wife of Agamemnon and killed him when he came back home, although he knew it would doom them all. So Aegisthus' crime is not just that he was committing adultery, but he killed the husband when he came back home. He was not a good guest. Agamemnon should be the host of the household. They should have welcomed him back, especially as a soldier. But no, they killed him, even though they knew it would doom them all. Zeus is the god of hospitality. So of course he would find this a huge issue. And then Athena agrees with him. "Father, he did deserve to die. Bring death to all who act like him." She's basically saying, bring death to all who act like bad house guests, or all who steal wives. Even adultery is kind of like acting like a bad house guest. Yeah. Think about Paris coming into Menelaus' house and stealing Helen. Very bad house guest. Okay. Here's an example of good Xenia, though, like being a good host to a guest. So Athena here is in disguise coming to Telemachus. Then from the mountain down, Athena sped to Ithaca and stopped outside Odysseus' court, bronze spear in hand. She looked like Mentis now, the Taphian leader, a guest friend. There she found the lordly suitors sitting on hides. They killed the cows themselves, and playing checkers. Quick, attentive house slaves were waiting on them. Some were mixing wine with water in the bowls, and others brought the tables out and wiped them off with sponges, and others carved up heaping plates of meat. Telemachus was sitting with them, feeling dejected. In his mind he saw his father, coming from somewhere, scattering the suitors and gaining back his honor and control of all his property. With this in mind, he was the first to see Athena there. He disapproved of leaving strangers stranded, so he went straight to meet her at the gate and shook her hand and took her spear of bronze and let his words fly out to her. "Good evening, stranger, and welcome. Be our guest. Come share our dinner and then tell us what you need." Okay, this is Telemachus. I'll start at the end. This is Telemachus being a very good house guest. He disapproved of leaving strangers stranded. He went to meet her at the gate. So even though Mentis is a stranger to him, he shakes Mentis' hand. He takes her spear that literally disarms him, makes him more friendly. And then, "Good evening, stranger, welcome, be our guest, come share our dinner, then tell us what you need." This is exactly what you should do in ancient Greek culture. You greet your guests, you give them a meal, sometimes you even clean them up, let them take a shower, and then you start to talk to them. You tell us what you need. So this is kind of what happens every time a good house host situation happens, is you feed them, you clothe them, etc., and then you say like, "Hey, who are you? What do you need? Let's be friends," kind of thing. So he's a good host to Athena when he sees her. He's not a very good host over here, though. Telemachus is sitting with the suitors feeling dejected, and he's basically fantasizing about his father murdering them. So why is he so hostile to the suitors? We get a clue as to why he's so hostile here. Athena saw the lordly suitors sitting on hides. They killed the cows themselves and playing checkers. The suitors are sitting on like leather hides from cows that they killed themselves, and they're playing games. this doesn't seem like a big deal, but it actually is kind of a big deal. The suitors have come into Odysseus's house and started killing his livestock and then making hides out of them, and then all they're doing is playing games. Meanwhile, they're just sitting around and eating and drinking. The suitors are really, really bad house guests. It's not really explicitly stated here, but what's going on is Odysseus has been gone for 10 years in the war and 10 years in his journey home. The suitors have been hanging around for years, being guests who are just eating and drinking and using Odysseus's kingdom for their benefit. So that's why Telemachus is so frustrated. He feels dejected because he has to be kind of a good guest. He can't like kill the suitors, like, because that would be that would be being a bad host. But on the other hand, these suitors are not being very good guests. They're overstaying their welcome. They won't leave. Okay, so yeah, hospitality is a big feature here. We see some other good examples of good hosts later in the epic through Telemachus especially. So Nestor, so he was a guy in the Iliad too. He was an older soldier in the Achaean side. Here's Athena and Telemachus visiting Nestor. So they go on a trip to Pylos. They reached the center of the town where Nestor was sitting with his sons and his companions, putting the meat on spits and roasting it for dinner. When they saw the strangers coming, they all stood up with open arms to greet them, inviting them to join them. Nestor's son, Pisistratus, shook hands and sat them down, spreading soft fleeces on the sand beside his father and his brother, Thrasymmedes. He served them giblets, and he poured some wine into a golden cup and raised a toast to Pallas, child of Zeus, the Aegis Lord. Great. So here, again, we have Nestor and his sons being wonderful hosts. They pour wine, and they serve them these great giblets, and they raise a toast to Athena without even knowing that it's actually Athena in disguise. This is like perfect host material here. They haven't even asked them their names yet, and they still treat them so well. And then later on, like, so lines later, now that our guests are satisfied with food, time now to talk to them and ask them questions. Strangers, who are you? Where did you sail from? Are you on business or just scouting around like pirates on the sea who risk their lives to ravage foreign homes? So, yeah, this is Xenia in action. You greet someone with just, hello. You feed them, and then you start asking them like the questions. And so, of course, this is going to turn strangers into friends, like if no one's mean to someone who just fed them, And so, like, this is a way to kind of create allies out of strangers. And it works, and they happen to know each other. It's wonderful. Also, at the end of all of these interchanges, there's gifts given. What does Telemachus gain at Pylos? So he gets, like, material goods. Nestor gives Telemachus 2 horses with fine manes, and he gives them a carriage, so our guest can start his journey. Great. He also gets news about Odysseus' journey. So Nestor knew Odysseus back at Troy. He says, back at Troy, Odysseus and I always agreed in councils with one mind. Your father's plans were always flexible. His men turned round their prows and sailed right back to make their peace again with Agamemnon, but I assembled all my feet and fled. Nestor's journey home was easy. Okay, so what we learn here is Odysseus was really flexible. They were going to leave Troy, but then Odysseus decided to go make peace with Agamemnon. So that's kind of interesting. Agamemnon ends up dying, so this might be kind of a clue to some dangers that Odysseus faced. We also learn that Nestor, his journey home from Troy was really easy. So Nestor has a really excellent Nostos, very easy one. He says he kept going on to Pylos. The wind the god had sent kept holding strong the whole way home. So, my dear boy, I have no news about what happened next. So even though this news is sort of disappointing, Telemachus doesn't get really any explicit news about his father. He does learn that it was possible for a soldier to come home from Troy quickly. So this might kind of be a clue about Odysseus's lengthy journey. Okay, so yeah, when you're a good host, when you're a good guest, you get kind of like gifts and stuff too. So this is great, and it helps Telemachus in his journey to learning more about his father. The next stop that Telemachus makes is to Sparta, where he meets Menelaus. So Menelaus is the former husband of Helen. Now he's remarried her after the war. This is what Telemachus learns from Menelaus. He learns where Odysseus is. Menelaus knows. So Menelaus tells Telemachus the story of wrestling the sea god named Proteus, and Proteus had to tell him what he wanted to know. So they learned that Ajax, the hero, drowned in the ocean, drowned by Poseidon's wrath. He learns that Agamemnon was killed by Aegisthus. Remember, Agamemnon is brothers to Menelaus, so this is actually really sad for Menelaus to tell this story that his brother was murdered. And then Menelaus also tells Telemachus of Odysseus. It is Laertes' son, the Ithacan. I saw him crying, shedding floods of tears upon Calypso's island in her chambers. She traps him there. He cannot go back home. So finally we learn where Odysseus is. He's trapped on Calypso's island by Calypso. We'll meet her eventually. She's a goddess who's very beautiful. And then Telemachus also gets some practical gifts too. And this is kind of interesting. Telemachus he kind of rejects some of the gifts that Menelaus wants to give him and asks for things that would be more suitable. You might think that this is rude, but actually it's treated as a symbol of Telemachus's wisdom. Okay, so he says, so Telemachus tactfully asks for more appropriate gifts and horses. Menelaus wants to give him horses because Sparta is known for horses. Telemachus says, actually, on Ithaca, we're a very small island. We don't really need horses that much. Maybe something else would be better to give me. And so Menelaus is excited by Telemachus being tactful here. He says, my boy, your words are proof of your good blood. I will give different gifts, just as you ask. I will give you the finest piece of treasure of all the hoard I have piled up at home, a finely crafted bowl, pure silver, blah, blah, blah. Hephaestus made it. Okay, you can have that. So yeah, it's kind of taken as a symbol of like good breeding and like wisdom that he asks for a more appropriate gift. Okay. I'll want to end with this interchange here. It's kind of long, but this is something else that Telemachus learns from Menelaus in Sparta. The sort of trauma that the soldiers are dealing with, and not just the soldiers, but everybody was dealing with after the Trojan War. So Ready Menelaus says these lines. So when the boys come, this is Telemachus and Pisistratus, who is Nestor's son. They come to Sparta. Menelaus says, help yourselves, enjoy the food. When you have shared our meal, we will begin to ask who you are. Your fathers must be scepter-bearing kings. The sons of peasants do not look like you. With that, he took the dish of rich roast meat cut from the back, which was his special meal, and offered it to them. They reached their hands to take the food set out before them, in front of them. After their thirst and hunger had been sated, Telemachus turned round to Nestor's son, ducking his head so no one else could hear, and says, Pisistratus, dear friend, do you see how these echoing halls are shining bright with bronze and silver, gold and ivory and amber? It is as full of riches as the palace of Zeus on Mount Olympus. I am struck with awe. When Menelaus heard these words, he spoke to them in turn. His words flew out. No mortal, my dear boys, can rival Zeus. His halls and home and property are deathless. Some man may match my wealth, or maybe not. I suffered for it. So here we see Menelaus as a good guest. Then we see Menelaus as this very, very rich man. He's got so many riches here at Sparta. They strike Telemachus with awe. He seems like he's Zeus. He's so wealthy. And Menelaus steps in and says, yes, I'm wealthy, but I suffered for this wealth. So how did he get the wealth, and how was it related to his suffering? Here we'll learn more. I suffered for it. I was lost adrift at sea for 8 long years. I traipsed through Cyprus, Phoenicia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Sidon, Arabia, and Libya, but while I wandered there accumulating wealth, someone crept in and killed my brother. His own scheming wife betrayed him. I can take no joy in all my wealth. Whoever they may be, your fathers have surely told you how much I have suffered. I lost my lovely home, and I was parted for many years from all my splendid riches. I wish I had stayed here, with just a third of all the treasure I have now acquired, if those who died at Troy so far away from Argive pastures were alive and well. I sit here in my palace, mourning all who died, and often weeping. Sometimes tears bring comfort to my heart, but not for long. Cold grief grows sickening. I miss them all, but one man most. When I remember him, I cannot eat or sleep, since no one labored like him, Odysseus. His destiny was suffering, and mine the endless pain of missing him. Okay, so quite a speech here. We learn a lot from it. Menelaus, it took him 8 years to get home from Troy when he was lost adrift. It's taken Odysseus 10, but Menelaus has suffered a lot. While he was adrift, getting home from Troy, his brother died. So of course he would feel guilty about this. And then given all that he's lost, all that he's suffered with these 8 long years and not being around to help his brother, he has this very interesting line. I wish I had stayed here with just a third of all the treasure I've now acquired, if those who died at Troy so far away were alive and well. I wish I had stayed here. Think about what these lines mean. If Menelaus had stayed at Sparta, that would mean that he wishes he let Paris take Helen. Menelaus is really he's the whole reason they even went to war to begin with, because his wife was stolen by Paris. But he says here that he suffered so much, he regrets so much, that he wishes he had just stayed here. Menelaus is saying this when Helen is in the room. This is kind of a lot, probably, for her to take. And then, of course, he says he really misses Odysseus. This is great to hear from Telemachus, who is Odysseus' son. This is just a little line about Odysseus. His destiny was suffering, this bit. The word Odysseus, people don't know exactly what it means, but it might be related to these Greek words that mean either to hate, to lament or bewail, or to perish or be lost. So all of these kind of words sound a little bit like Odysseus. And the name Odysseus often in this epic is kind of presented as like someone who's born to suffer. So, okay. Odysseus is born to suffer, apparently. Okay. Crying for Troy and its limits. So after Menelaus says this stuff about Odysseus, here we go. We start crying. These words roused in the boy a desperate need to mourn his own father. Tears rolled down his face and splashed down on the ground. His words made everyone want to cry. Helen was weeping, as was Menelaus. Pisistratus' eyes were full of tears for irreplaceable Antilochus, killed by the noble son of shining dawn. Mindful of him, he spoke with words like wings. King Menelaus, when we spoke of you back home in our own halls, my father Nestor always declared you are exceptional for common sense. So listen now to me. I disapprove of crying during dinner. Dawn will soon come. Weep then. There is no harm in mourning when a person dies. It is the only honor we can pay the dead, to cut our hair and drench our cheeks with tears. I had a brother named Antilochus, one of the bravest fighters in the army, a sprinter and a warrior. He died. I never got to meet him or to see him. Perhaps you did. So I read this in whole because it speaks to, there's going to be a lot of crying in the Odyssey. Here, everyone is really, really crying, especially because Troy was such a traumatic experience for everyone. They lost so many loved ones and heroes at Troy. The men in this room here have lost so many people, they're all crying for them. But Pisistratus reminds everyone that, like, there's a time for weeping, and it's when someone dies. But if you spend too much time weeping, you don't get information that you might need. And he says that he lost a brother, and he was one of the bravest fighters. He died. I never got to meet him, but perhaps you did. If you're too busy weeping, you might lose the opportunity to learn about the past and to learn new things. So I want to kind of end today with this discussion here, mourning versus forgetting. That's kind of partly what the Odyssey is about, in a sense. Like, how do you move on from the legacy of Troy? Do you live in perpetual mourning for what Troy was and what we lost in the Trojan War? Or do you just try to forget about it and move forward? There's kind of like a delicate balance here. And the Odyssey, as an epic, is trying to negotiate that balance. Menelaus says, yes, we will stop crying and turn our minds to dinner once again. Let them pour water on our hands. At dawn, Telemachus and I can talk at length. At that, Asphilion, the nimble house slave of mighty Menelaus, poured the water over their hands. They helped themselves to food from laden tables. Then the child of Zeus, Helen, decided she would mix the wine with drugs to take all pain and rage away, to bring forgetfulness of every evil. Whoever drinks this mixture from the bowl will shed no tears that day, not even if her mother or father die, not even if soldiers kill her brother or her darling son with bronze spears before her very eyes. Helen had these powerful magic drugs from Polydamna, wife of Thon from Egypt, whose fertile fields produce the most narcotics, some good, some dangerous. The people there are skillful doctors. They are the healer's people. She mixed the wine and told the slave to pour it. So here we have Helen stepping in to drug everyone. She's drugging them with powerful magical drugs that are in part good and in part dangerous. This is an interesting moment. Why would Helen particularly want to drug everyone? She sort of suspects that if the conversation keeps going the way it's going, people will start to turn to her and blame her for what happened at Troy. You know, her husband has already said he wishes he didn't go to Troy at all to get her back. Helen here is, you know, in some ways she's trying to kind of protect herself. But in other ways, maybe she just wants people to not be in pain anymore. You know, she's caused a lot of harm. And so is it so bad to want people just to forget what happened? So kind of keep this in mind, you know, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on drugs and other means of forgetting. How do you deal with the legacy of something traumatic like war or like adultery or like having an absent father? You know, do you mourn for it? Or do you want to just forget it and move on? Anyway. The last thing that I'll leave you with today is we also get gifts for Telemachus in the form of stories about Odysseus. So we get a story from Menelaus and a story from Helen, both about Odysseus. So I'll start with the Helen one. Helen tells Telemachus this great story about his father. She says, I cannot tell of all the challenges steadfast Odysseus has undergone, but I will tell you what that brave man did at Troy when the Achaeans were in trouble. He beat himself and bruised his body badly and put a ragged cloak on like a slave, then shuffled through the enemy's city streets. In his disguise, he seemed a poor old beggar, hardly a man to sail with the Achaeans. He crept through Troy like that, and no one knew him, except for me. I saw through his disguise and questioned him. He was too smart to talk, acting evasive. On his way back, he used his long bronze sword to slaughter many Trojans, and he brought useful intelligence to tell the Greeks. The Trojan women keened in grief, but I was glad. By then I wanted to go home. I wished that Aphrodite had not made me go crazy when she took me from my country and made me leave my daughter and the bed I shared with my fine, handsome, clever husband. So this story is very, very interesting. We not only learn about how brave and kind of crafty Odysseus is, like we learn that he will like bruise his body and dress like a beggar to trick people. This is something he'll do later, by the way. We also learn that Helen is, again, she's trying to protect herself a little bit here. She tells this story where a Greek is killing Trojans, slaughtering Trojans. Helen was a Greek, but then she aligned with the Trojans, Helen of Troy, right? She says, I wanted to go home by then. So she's kind of being, you know, she's trying to protect herself a little bit here because she knows her husband is listening to the story she's telling. You know, and then I wish Aphrodite had not made me go crazy. So it wasn't her fault that she left, but it was Aphrodite's fault. Aphrodite love made her go crazy. Love made her forget her fine, handsome, clever husband. So she's kind of pretty interesting. Anyway, I'll stop there with her story. And then here's Menelaus' story about Odysseus. Yes, wife, quite right. I have been round the world. I have met many heroic men and known their minds. I never saw a man so resolute as that Odysseus. How tough he was. And what an impressive fortitude he showed inside the wooden horse. We fighters lurked inside to bring destruction to the Trojans. You came there too. Some spirit who desired to glorify the Trojans urged you on. 3 times you went round the hollow belly, touching the hiding place, and calling on us Greeks by name. You put on different voices for each man's wife. Then I and Diomedes and good Odysseus, inside the horse, heard you call out to us, and we too wanted to go out, or to answer from in there. Odysseus prevented us from going. Then all the other sons of the Achaeans were quiet. Anticlus still wished to answer. Odysseus' hands clamped shut his mouth and saved us all. He held him there like that until Athena led you far away. This is a very interesting story here. Helen told a story that presented her in a good light. You know, she saw through Odysseus' disguise. She actually didn't want to be in Troy anymore. She wanted to go back to her husband. But actually, Menelaus, his story about Odysseus and Helen reveals that actually Helen really, really tried to get the Greeks inside the Trojan horse killed. So if you guys know the Trojan horse story, it was Odysseus' idea to build this horse that was like a giant, hollow wooden gift for the Trojans. His idea was all the several Greek heroes would hide inside of the horse. When the Greeks wheel the horse inside of their city, at nightfall, the Greeks would come out of the horse and then attack everyone and be able to, cause the fall of the city. But here in Menelaus' story, Helen seems to be very magical here. Some spirit urged her to walk 3 times around the horse and put on different voices for each man's wife. So she's ventriloquizing the voices of the wives of the men inside the horse. Maybe Odysseus doesn't fall for it, but this guy, Anticlus, really wanted to answer his wife. He hears his wife. Remember, these guys have been fighting the war for 10 years. Of course, they'd want to go home and be with their wives. Here is a moment when they're hallucinating, hearing their wife's voice. But if they were to make a sound, they would totally give away the fact that they're hiding inside of this horse, and they would all be killed. So anyway, these stories are very interesting in their depictions of Helen. And also interesting in how these stories glorify Odysseus for Telemachus. So think of all the things that Telemachus is learning by hearing these stories of his father's friends. Anyway, and also thinking about the legacy of this huge conflict at Troy. Not only are these soldiers traumatized, but clearly Helen is dealing with a lot of stuff. Having come home to Menelaus and trying to reconnect as husband and wife again after this huge breach of trust between them. Okay, so I will end it there. We've got such an interesting depiction of a husband figure and a wife figure. This sort of sets the scene for the reconciliation or the reconnection of Odysseus with his wife. So they're kind of in a similar position. Think about how Agamemnon was killed by his wife. Menelaus and his wife are having a lot of trouble. This is sort of setting the scene for Odysseus coming home to his wife, Penelope. Maybe we'll talk more about Penelope next time, but yeah. Okay, I'll end there for today.